The Consciousness Code Podcast Episode 6, Emotional Hijacking and False Certainty when feeling certain is not the same as seeing clearly. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. In the last episode, we explored the sliding scale of awareness, the reality that consciousness is not fixed, not equal all day, not one stable quantity we simply possess once we are awake. We looked at how awareness sharpens and dulls, widens and narrows, gathers and fragments depending on fatigue, grief, illness, relief, attraction, urgency, overstimulation, and the changing conditions of life. In this episode, we move into one of the most powerful forces shaping those shifts, emotion. Because strong emotion does not simply change what we feel, it changes what we think we know. It changes what seems obvious. It changes what feels true. It changes what interpretation becomes available first. It changes what we can no longer hold. Often, it changes all of this so quickly that we do not notice the shift until certainty has already taken over. That is why this episode matters, because some of the moments in which we feel most convinced are not the moments in which we see most clearly. Some of the moments in which we feel most morally certain, most relationally certain, most psychologically certain, most politically certain, most personally certain, are actually the moments in which awareness has narrowed the most. And this is difficult to admit because certainty feels powerful, it feels grounding, it feels clarifying, it feels like the end of confusion, it feels like contact with reality, it feels like the truth. But very often certainty is not the same as clarity. Very often certainty is what a narrowed system feels like from the inside. That distinction is one of the most important distinctions in conscious life, because when emotion intensifies, the whole field can reorganize. The body tightens, attention contracts, interpretation accelerates. The mind becomes less willing to tolerate ambiguity. What was uncertain a moment ago starts to feel obvious. What was complex starts to feel simple. What might have needed patience starts to feel like it needs a verdict. And if we do not understand that process, we will keep mistaking activation for insight. We will mistake panic for perception, jealousy for evidence, outrage for moral clarity, shame for the truth, defensiveness for self-protection, urgency for importance, intensity for accuracy. That confusion is everywhere now. It is in online arguments. It is in politics. It is in text messages. It is in family tension. It is in relationships. It is in shame spirals. It is in righteous certainty. It is in the quick collapse from feeling something strongly to assuming we now know exactly what it means. Perhaps one of the hardest parts is that emotional certainty often feels more real than calm reflection. Because calm reflection can feel slow, it can feel unsatisfying, it can feel uncertain, it can feel like not knowing yet. Emotion, by contrast, gives force, direction, an enemy, a conclusion, a shape. It does not just say, something is happening. It often says, I know what is happening, I know what it means, and I know who is to blame. That is why emotional hijacking can be so seductive, not only because it overwhelms us, but because it can make us feel temporarily more coherent than uncertainty ever does, and that is a dangerous gift. So in this episode, I want to look closely at that process. How emotion overtakes reflection, why activation simplifies reality, why certainty is so emotionally rewarding, how conviction becomes a form of defense, how relationships collapse under emotional certainty, how online culture and political life intensify this dynamic constantly, and what it means to slow the leap from feeling to truth. Because the aim here is not to distrust emotion. Emotion is real, it matters, it carries information. It tells us something important about what is happening in us. But a strong feeling is not the same as a final interpretation. That may be the central sentence of this entire episode. Feeling something deeply does not automatically mean you are seeing it clearly, and once that lands, even a little, so much of human conflict starts to become more readable. The argument escalates before either person has really understood what the other meant. The message feels loaded before any clarification is sought. The jealousy that becomes a story before evidence exists. The panic that becomes prophecy. The shame that becomes identity. The outrage that becomes certainty. The righteousness that becomes blindness. All of these are forms of emotional narrowing, pretending to be the whole truth. So this episode is really about learning how to recognize that narrowing while it is happening, not in hindsight only, not once the damage is done, not once has the story hardened beyond easy reach, but earlier in the body, earlier in the mind, earlier in the shift, earlier in the moment when the feeling starts becoming a verdict. That is where we are going today, into emotional heat, into certainty, into contraction, into urgency, into the persuasive force of feeling when feeling becomes interpretive authority. If we do this well, the aim is not to become colder. It is to become more conscious of the intensity, more able to feel without immediately collapsing into explanation, more able to recognize conviction without worshipping it, more able to remain with the reality of emotion without handing it total control over meaning. So that is where we begin, with a truth that is simple but very difficult to live by. Feeling certain is not the same as seeing clearly. Feeling certain is not the same as seeing clearly. Most of us know what it is like to feel absolutely certain in a moment, and then later realize that the certainty was not the truth itself, but the shape emotion gave the moment while it had us. That is an uncomfortable recognition, because certainty feels so persuasive. It feels like contact. It feels like seeing. It feels like finally understanding what this is. It feels like confusion has ended and reality has come into focus. But often what has really happened is that awareness has narrowed. Because narrowing simplifies experience, it can produce the feeling of clarity without the actual breadth of it. That is the difference we have to keep returning to here. Clarity can hold complexity. Certainty often cannot. Clarity can remain open a little longer. Certainty wants closure now. Clarity can say something matters here, but I need to understand it more. Certainly says, I already know what this means. In ordinary life, that difference is easy to miss because strong feelings create such a convincing internal atmosphere. Take jealousy. A message is delayed. A tone shifts. A person seems distracted. An interaction feels slightly different. At first, perhaps there is only a flicker, something subtle, bodily, pre-verbal, but then the system tightens. Attention narrows. The mind starts connecting dots. What was once simply unknown starts becoming meaningful in a very specific way. The body leans toward the possibility of betrayal, withdrawal, comparison, replacement, and exclusion. And within a surprisingly short space of time, the feeling can become a full explanation. I know what this is. I know what they're doing. I know what this means. That certainty may feel profound, but it is often not the same as clear seeing. It is the emotional system trying to end uncertainty by making meaning fast. The same thing happens in panic. The body changes first. Breath shifts. The heart pounds. Attention contracts. The world starts reorganizing around danger. Once the body has moved into that state, the mind begins interpreting from inside it. Suddenly, ordinary sensations feel ominous. Ordinary uncertainty feels intolerable. Ordinary thought becomes catastrophic. Panic does not just make you feel afraid. It creates a world in which fear feels rational. That is why panic can feel like revelation, not because it reveals reality clearly, but because it removes competing interpretations so quickly that only one frame remains available. The same happens in shame. Under shame, one thought can begin to dominate everything. I am the problem. This proves something terrible about me. This is who I really am. Again, the certainty can feel total, not vague, not partial, total. That is one of the hallmarks of emotionally narrowed consciousness, totality. Everything starts feeling conclusive. One comment proves everything. One silence means everything. One mistake defines everything. One expression reveals everything. When we are inside that totality, it can feel absurd even to question it. This is why emotionally charged certainty is so dangerous. Not because it always contains no truth at all, but because it often contains some truth wrapped inside a state that has lost proportionality. There may indeed be something off, something painful, something worth noticing, something is wrong, something real. But the emotional state can make the real thing feel larger, simpler, cleaner, more final, and more obvious than it actually is. That is why this episode begins here with certainty, because certainty is often the emotional reward for narrowed awareness. When complexity falls away, certainty rushes in. When ambiguity becomes unbearable, certainty becomes relief. When the body needs a clear target, certainty provides one. When not knowing is too painful, certainty gives the mind something to stand on. That does not mean certainty is always false. It means certainty is never proof on its own. That is a very different way of thinking about our emotional life. Most of us were not taught to question certainty itself. We were taught to question doubt, hesitation, confusion, insecurity, and indecision. But certainty often gets treated as maturity, as decisiveness, as a strength, as conviction, as contact with truth. And in some contexts, certainty may indeed reflect real clarity. But in many everyday moments, certainty is simply what a highly activated state feels like. That is especially true in arguments. How often does someone say, I know exactly what you meant by that, when in reality what they know is what it felt like to them? How often do we decide within seconds that the other person was disrespectful, manipulative, selfish, controlling, cold, dismissive, uninterested, arrogant, attacking, or unloving, not because we have calmly explored the field, but because the emotional system has already moved toward one dominant meaning? That is not stupidity. It is human, but it is dangerous. Once certainty hardens, listening becomes difficult. Curiosity becomes difficult. Complexity becomes difficult. And the relationship begins collapsing under the weight of one person's felt truth, becoming the only permitted reality in the room. This is also why online life has become such fertile ground for false certainty. Emotion moves quickly online. Context is thin. The tone is unstable. Projection is easy. Social reward for outrage is immediate. Nuance is effortful. Certainty performs well. So a person feels something sharply, and within moments that feeling has become an interpretation, accusation, identity position, and moral judgment. The emotional system has little friction there. It can leap straight from activation to proclamation. What is true online is often true in ourselves too, even in private. We feel hurt and call it clarity. We feel threatened and call it discernment. We feel ashamed and call it the truth. We feel intense and call it insight. That is the pattern this whole episode is trying to expose, not to make us colder, not to make us distrust feelings, but to make us more literate in emotional force. Because if we do not understand how convincing a narrowed state can feel, then we will keep handing interpretive authority to whichever emotion is loudest. That is one of the easiest ways to lose consciousness, while still believing we are most awake. So the hook of this episode is not simply that emotion is strong. It is that emotional certainty can feel like the clearest version of us precisely when it is often the least spacious. That is the trap. Once you see that trap, even dimly, you begin to live differently. You begin to notice the body beneath the certainty, the urgency beneath the explanation, the hurt beneath the righteous tone, the fear beneath the confident conclusion, the shame beneath the final verdict. That noticing is the first interruption. Because once you can recognize that feeling certain is not the same as seeing clearly, the emotion may still be there, but it is no longer the whole truth speaking without challenge, and that is where emotional freedom begins. How emotion overtakes reflection. Emotion does not usually ask permission from reflection before it moves. It arrives first as sheer foot, as a charge, as tightening, as heat, as acceleration, as a contraction, as a change in the field. Only afterwards, and often very quickly afterwards, thought begins trying to explain what has already started happening. That is one of the central truths of this episode. We like to imagine that we feel something because we have already understood the situation, but often the sequence is more immediate and more embodied than that. Something in the body registers significance. Attention narrows. Salience intensifies. The mind starts assembling meaning from inside that state, and by the time the reflective self is fully online, the emotional event may already have momentum. Feldman and colleagues, writing in 2024 on interoception and effect, describe emotion as deeply tied to bodily signaling and predictive regulation, rather than as something simply added to thought after the fact. Predictive processing approaches make a similar point. The brain is already anticipating, weighing, and interpreting bodily and environmental signals before we reach a clean verbal account of what is happening. So let's make this practical. Imagine you are sitting at home in the evening and you send a message to someone you care about. Usually, they reply quite quickly. This time, nothing comes back for an hour. At first, there was only a tiny shift, a flicker of attention, a slight tightening in the stomach, a subtle narrowing of awareness. You check the phone again. Still nothing. Now the body becomes more involved. Breath shortens a little. The chest tightens. The mind begins generating possible meanings. Did I say something wrong? Are they pulling away? Are they with someone else? Have they lost interest? Notice what happened. The absence of a reply did not result in an empty system. It arrived in a body that knows attachment, expectation, memory, hope, fear, and prior experience. The nervous system does not wait for a philosophical discussion about evidence before beginning to weigh the event. Emotion begins to overtake reflection because the system is trying to solve uncertainty quickly. And once uncertainty feels dangerous enough, the mind often prefers a painful conclusion to an open question. That is how emotional hijacking begins, not always with a dramatic explosion, often with a contraction, a narrowing, a quickening of meaning. From there, reflection is no longer happening from open ground. It is happening from inside activation. This is one reason attention research matters here. Brosh and colleagues showed that emotion changes perception, attention, and memory by prioritizing what appears significant. Emotion does not merely color experience after it has been neutrally perceived. It changes what gets into awareness, what becomes central, and what gets remembered most strongly. More recent work, such as Jiao in 2025 on cognitive control under negative emotion priming, suggests that negative emotional states can change how proactive and reactive control are recruited. In simple language, the mind does not think the same way under emotional load as it does in a more settled state. Take a second scenario. You are in an argument with someone close to you. They say one sentence in a sharper tone than usual. Step 1. The tone lands before the meaning is fully processed. Step 2. The body registers a threat. Step 3. Attention narrows around the threatening feature, the tone, the phrase, the expression. Step 4. Older emotional patterning begins to fill in likely meanings. Step 5. The body moves toward defense. Step 6. The mind produces a fast explanation. They don't respect me. They are trying to control me. They always do this. Step 7. What began as one charged moment is now an entire interpretation. And by this point, reflection is no longer leading. It is following. This is where many people get confused. They believe they are thinking clearly because they can explain what is happening in full sentences. But the existence of a coherent sentence does not prove that reflection was first. Often the sentence is the first polished form of something much more immediate and bodily that has already taken over the room. That is why strong emotion can feel like insight. It gives speed. It gives force. It gives simplification. It gives a sense that the truth has become obvious. But obviousness is not always the same as clarity. In phenomenological terms, the world under emotion becomes reconfigured. The emotional state changes the horizon of significance. Certain features become luminous, others disappear. A pause becomes rejection. A question becomes an accusation. A silence becomes contempt. A look becomes evidence. Phenomenology has always been helpful here because it reminds us that experience is not received from nowhere. It is lived through a body and a world already structured by concern, anticipation, memory, and relation. Emotional states do not merely happen inside us. They reorganize how the world shows up. Neuroscience describes something similar in a different language. Under emotional activation, the relationship between salience, interoceptive signaling, and cognitive control shifts. The system begins to favor speed, relevance, and possible threat over wide reflective consideration. In ordinary life, this can feel like the sudden reduction of complexity. What was once uncertain now seems obvious. What had several possible meanings now seems to have one. This does not mean the mind becomes stupid. It means the mind becomes strategic under pressure, and one of the strategies of pressure is simplification. This is why we cannot accept a purely rational narrative of emotional life. A purely rational narrative says, first, we gather facts, then we interpret them, then emotion follows accordingly. But lived experience does not usually work in that order. Emotion often enters before the facts have been fully organized. The body often reacts before the narrative stabilizes. The field of awareness often contracts before the explanation arrives. The explanation often grows from inside the contracted state. So when people insist on a purely rational account, they are often trying to preserve a flattering image of being as fundamentally governed by detached thought. But psychology, neuroscience, phenomenology, contemplative science, and simple honesty all point towards something more complex. Reflection is real, but it is often downstream of state. That does not mean reason is useless. It means reason is often late, and this is where different schools start arguing. The neuroscientific school may say, what you are calling emotional hijacking is an interaction among interoception salience networks, autonomic arousal, and changing executive control. The psychological school may say, this is appraisal, attentional capture, projection, bias, and effect-laden interpretation. The contemplative school may say, this is contraction, grasping, identification, and loss of spacious awareness. The phenomenological school may say, this is a narrowing of world disclosure, in which one emotionally saturated interpretation dominates the field. If we are not careful, those schools start fighting for ownership as though only one of them can be true. But often they are naming different levels of the same event. One names mechanism, one names behavior, one names lived experience, one names practice. The battle begins when the ego enters the theory. Then what is at stake is no longer just understanding, but authority. Whose language gets to define the event? Whose framework wins? Whose truth becomes the acceptable one? That dynamic mirrors the emotional hijacking we are discussing, because in both cases, certainty becomes seductive. The scientist may become certain that the mechanism explains everything. The philosopher may become certain that lived experience outranks all mechanisms. The contemplative may become certain that awareness practice alone reaches the deepest truth. The clinician may become certain that their model best organizes suffering. Sometimes each is partly right, but the need to be the one who finally names the truth can itself become a defense against tolerating complexity. So perhaps one of the more mature recognitions is this: emotion overtakes reflection in one language. Interoceptive prediction overtakes deliberation in another. Contraction overtakes spaciousness in another. World disclosure narrows in another. These may not be rival realities. They may be translations. When we understand that, we stop trying to reduce the event to one authorized vocabulary. We become more interested in reading what is happening faithfully. Let's return to everyday life. Imagine you are scrolling online and you come across a post that touches something political, moral, or cultural that already matters to you. At first, there is a surge. It may be anger, shame, defensiveness, moral heat, disgust, vindication. The body tightens. Attention locks in. The world of nuance begins to narrow. Now the post is no longer simply information. It has become an emotionally charged object. Social learning research helps explain why this intensifies so quickly online. Brady and colleagues in 2021 found that outrage expressed on social media is amplified by social reinforcement. The more outrage is rewarded, the more it gets repeated. Wilkie, 2025, also describes emotional contagion online through pathways shaped by appraisal, uncertainty, and social amplification. So online environments do not merely host emotional hijacking, they train and reward it. Now reflection has even less room. Why? Because the activated state has fused with identity and audience. You are not only feeling something, you are feeling it publicly, morally, and perhaps tribally. That makes the emotional certainty even more intoxicating. The system now receives a reward for quick interpretation, quick condemnation, quick alliance building, and quick certainty, and this is where emotional hijacking becomes culturally dangerous. Because once activation is socially rewarded, reflection starts to look weak, slow, or suspicious. A person who pauses is treated as morally compromised. A person who asks for complexity is treated as evasive. A person who hesitates is treated as disloyal. In that atmosphere, feeling and truth collapse into one another almost instantly. But in private life, something similar happens too. Jealousy does not want ambiguity. Panic does not want uncertainty. Shame does not want an open question. Rage does not want context. Each state wants a stable meaning quickly. That is why strong emotion often overtakes reflection. Reflection tolerates complexity and delay, whereas activation seeks orientation and relief. Relief matters here, because certainty relieves, even when it is wrong, even when it is cruel, even when it collapses reality too fast. A painful certainty can feel easier to live with than an uncertain hurt. This is why some people would rather decide they do not care about me than remain with the slower and more vulnerable reality of I do not yet know what is happening, and that not knowing hurts. The first is emotionally brutal, but it is closed. The second is open, and openness can feel unbearable under activation. This is what makes emotional certainty so powerful. It is not only that the body becomes loud, it is the loudness that offers false closure. Now, if we move into contemplative perspectives, the same pattern appears in slightly different language. Practices of mindfulness and contemplative observation often train a person to notice the arising of feeling before it hardens into identity or interpretation. Lazzarelli, in 2024, reviewing interoceptive ability and emotion regulation in mind-body interventions, notes that mindfulness practices can improve interoceptive ability and emotion regulation through top-down and bottom-up pathways. In plain language, these practices may help create more room between the first bodily emotional shift and the full narrative takeover. That does not mean emotion disappears. It means the person may gain a small interval in which to recognize something strong is moving through me, but it is not yet the whole truth. That interval is precious, because it is where reflection can begin to catch up before certainty hardens completely, and perhaps that is the deepest point of this section. Emotion overtakes reflection, not because reflection is fake, but because emotion changes the field faster than reflection usually moves. The body reads significance, attention narrows, salience intensifies, possible meanings rush in, and the mind, now working inside activation, begins constructing a world that feels immediate, coherent, and true. Sometimes that world contains an important truth, sometimes it contains distortion. Usually, it contains some mixture of both. The task is not to become emotionless. The task is not to distrust all conviction. The task is to understand the sequence well enough that strong feelings no longer get automatic control over what counts as reality. That is where consciousness becomes possible inside intensity, not by silencing emotion, but by learning to recognize the moment it starts overtaking reflection. Why activation simplifies reality when emotion takes over. One of the first things it does is simplify, not because the world has suddenly become simple, but because the system can no longer afford the same degree of openness to complexity. Under strong activation, awareness tends to narrow, interpretation speeds up, ambiguity becomes harder to tolerate, and one explanation starts feeling not just likely but obvious. That is one of the most important things to understand about emotional hijacking. It not only makes us feel more, it often makes us see less while convincing us that we are seeing more. Let's slow that down through an ordinary scenario. You are already tired, the day has been long, your body is carrying low-grade tension. You send a message to someone close to you. Usually, they reply with warmth. This time, the response is brief. Step 1, you read the words. Step 2, before thought fully forms, the body reacts. Perhaps your stomach tightens. Perhaps your chest hardens slightly. Perhaps your breathing shortens. This is the pre-verbal part of the sequence, the point at which the system is already appraising significance before a full narrative has arrived. In the language of Stephen Porges, this kind of fast bodily appraisal is often described as neuroception, an unconscious detection of safety danger or threat through autonomic pathways. Porges' framework has been influential, especially clinically, though it remains debated in some scientific circles, and should be used as a helpful model rather than an unquestioned doctrine. Step 3. Attention narrows. The rest of the room recedes. The body is no longer processing the whole evening with equal openness. It is processing this. The shortness of the reply becomes central. This narrowing is not merely psychological in the casual sense. Attention research and neuropsychological work suggest that under emotionally charged conditions, salience is redistributed, and some signals become disproportionately dominant. That is one reason strong emotion can feel so clarifying from the inside. The system is reducing the field. Step 4. Meaning accelerates. Now the mind starts generating possibilities, but because activation is already present, the possibilities are not all equally weighted. Certain interpretations feel heavier. They're annoyed. Something's wrong. I've done something. They're pulling away. Once this starts, reflection is no longer entering a neutral scene. It is entering a body that has already shifted, an attentional field that has already narrowed, and a meaning process already leaning toward one dominant frame. Step 5. Certainty begins to appear, not because evidence is complete, but because uncertainty has become harder to hold. And this is where activation becomes epistemically dangerous. The mind is no longer just reading the event. It is trying to end the discomfort of not knowing. A sharp answer becomes more emotionally bearable than an open question. In this sense, certainty can function as a regulation strategy. It calms the system by closing the field. That is the sequence. Body shift, attentional narrowing, accelerated meaning, premature certainty. Once you see that sequence clearly enough, you begin to understand why activation simplifies reality. It simplifies because a narrow field is easier to act in than an open one. It simplifies because the body wants orientation. It simplifies because ambiguity is expensive under stress. It simplifies because one clear enemy, one clear explanation, or one clear narrative often feels safer than a painful unknown. Now apply that same sequence to a different situation. You are in a conversation with your partner, friend, or family member. They pause too long before replying. Step 1. The pause lands. Step 2. The body orients. You do not need to consciously decide to care. The system has already noticed the disruption in rhythm. Step 3. Prior learning enters. If silence has historically preceded criticism, withdrawal, rejection, or contempt in your life, the body may weigh the pause very differently than someone else's body would. Step 4. Attention collapses around the pause. The rest of the conversation becomes less available. Step 5. An explanation rushes in. They're upset. They've checked out. They're judging me. This is going badly. Step 6. Your own tone changes in response to an interpretation that has not yet been tested. And now the emotional reading you formed begins shaping the interaction itself. This is where emotional hijacking becomes relationally powerful. It does not just distort private perception. It can alter the behavior that then changes the other person's response, which in turn seems to confirm the original feeling. A brief silence becomes tension, tension becomes defensive tone produces distance, and the distance is then read as proof that the first conclusion was right. In that sense, activated interpretations can become self-reinforcing loops. Now, if we bring in personality traits and styles, the picture becomes even more nuanced. Not everybody narrows in the same way. Some people are highly threat-sensitive and quickly move toward anxious over-interpretation. Others move toward anger, others toward withdrawal, others toward performative composure, others toward collapse, shame, or dissociation. This is where talking about maladaptive personality traits can be useful, so long as we do it carefully and without turning people into labels. The broad literature on personality functioning increasingly suggests that traits associated with emotional dysregulation, antagonism, disinhibition, detachment, or unstable self-image shape how emotion is processed and how quickly the system moves from feeling into interpretation. Nazari and colleagues in 2025, for example, found that emotion dysregulation mediates the relationship between maladaptive personality traits and overall personality functioning. In other words, dysregulation is not just a side issue. It is one of the mechanisms through which personality difficulties become a lived reality. This is one reason traits commonly associated with what psychiatry calls cluster B patterns can matter in a discussion like this, not for stigma, but for clarity. Borderline personality organization, for example, is strongly associated with intense affective shifts, abandonment sensitivity, unstable self-image, and rapid changes in how others are perceived. Blake-Senring and colleagues' 2024 comprehensive review describes borderline personality disorder in terms of affective instability, interpersonal instability, impulsivity, intense anger, emptiness, and transient stress-related paranoia or dissociative symptoms. The 2024 meta-analysis by Diorio and colleagues also found neuropsychological difficulties in inhibition, attention memory, and executive function associated with borderline pathology. These findings help explain why activation can simplify reality so quickly in some people. Once emotionally triggered, the system may lose access to the reflective distance required to hold multiple interpretations at once. That does not mean people with these patterns are simply irrational. It means the cost of holding ambiguity, relational uncertainty, and emotional pain may be much higher, and therefore, the pressure toward immediate meaning, immediate certainty, and immediate defensive structure may also be higher. That principle does not apply only to diagnosable disorders. Many of us have trait patterns that pull us in one direction or another. High negative affectivity may push us toward threat-heavy readings. High antagonism may push us toward blame and moral certainty. High detachment may push us toward cold interpretation and withdrawal. High disinhibition may push us toward impulsive, emotionally driven action before reflection catches up. So when we talk about activation simplifying reality, we are not talking about one uniform human mechanism. We are talking about a common human pattern filtered through individual nervous systems, traits, histories, attachment styles, and learned forms of protection. Now let's go wider. Consider a political argument online. Someone posts something morally provocative. You read it. Step 1. The post lands not as neutral information, but as a social signal. Step 2. The body registers anger, disgust, fear, or shame. If the topic touches identity, status, belonging, or group loyalty, the effect intensifies. Step 3. Attention narrows around the offensive or threatening parts of the post. Context drops away. Step 4. The mind begins simplifying. This person is dangerous. This proves everything. These people are all the same. Anyone who disagrees is part of the problem. Step 5. Emotional conviction now feels morally elevated. It does not feel like one reactive state among many. It feels like justice, truth, and duty. This is where activation becomes socially contagious. Once one person's narrowing is expressed publicly, it invites alignment, outrage, reinforcement, and tribal simplification in others. Their nervous systems resonate with the emotional frame. What was one contracted interpretation starts becoming a shared moral reality. That is one reason emotionally activated groups often become less complex, less curious, and more certain than the individual members might be in calmer states. This is exactly where philosophy becomes useful, because at this point, different traditions begin offering different explanations for the same event. A neuroscientific perspective may say salient systems, autonomic arousal, interoceptive signaling, and impaired executive regulation are dominating the interpretive field. The psychological perspective may say emotional dysregulation, defensive appraisal, attachment sensitivity, and trait-level vulnerability are collapsing ambiguity. A phenomenological perspective may say the world has narrowed into one emotionally saturated horizon in which other possibilities are no longer showing up real. A contemplative perspective may say the mind has grasped around one painful or inflaming narrative and lost its wider awareness. These are not necessarily enemies. They may be naming different layers of the same contraction. This matters because one of the habits of the modern mind is to force one authorized narrative on experience. We want one framework to own the truth, one theory to explain the event in full, one language to dominate the field. But lived reality often resists that kind of reduction. Sometimes what we are looking at is not one truth versus another, but one event showing itself differently depending on the lens. That is a difficult point to hold because the ego wants ownership. The neuroscientific ego wants to say, this is all mechanism. The therapeutic ego wants to say, this is all trauma and attachment. The contemplative ego wants to say, this is all identification and contraction. The philosophical ego wants to say, this is all an error in how the world is disclosed. Perhaps each is partly right, but perhaps the fight itself tells us something too. The wish to have one truth accepted over another may itself be a defense against the discomfort of complexity, a way of relieving uncertainty, a way of reducing the field. In that sense, whole schools of thought can become emotionally invested in simplification, just as individuals do. The battle over explanatory supremacy may at times be less about truth itself and more about the need for conceptual control. That is not an argument against theory. It is an argument for humility, because if we are honest, activation does seem to be one thing appearing through multiple descriptions. It is bodily, it is attentional, it is interpretive, it is relational, it is existential, it is lived. Perhaps that is enough for our purposes here, not to prove one camp right, but to understand the sequence well enough that we stop mistaking simplification for revelation, because that is really what activation does. It reduces the world. It makes one meaning louder than all the others. It makes one feel like the whole truth. It makes one conclusion feel necessary. Sometimes that conclusion contains part of the truth. Sometimes it contains a distortion. Usually it contains both. This is where the deeper work begins. Not distrusting all emotion, not in becoming detached from life, not in trying to flatten intensity into some sterile rationality, but in recognizing the moment when emotion starts overtaking reflection and shrinking the field. That moment may feel like, I know exactly what this means. This proves everything. There is only one explanation. I don't need to ask. I can feel it. This is obvious. That is the moment to become curious. Not because curiosity solves the pain immediately, but because curiosity slows the collapse. Once the collapse slows, reflection can begin returning. Not pure reflection, not a perfectly detached reason, but enough reflection to ask, what shifted in me first? What is my body doing? What am I no longer able to hold? What other interpretations have disappeared from the room? What does this certainty protect me from having to feel or not know? Those questions do not make emotion less real, they make it more readable, and that is the central movement of this part of the episode. Emotion overtakes reflection by changing the body, narrowing attention, accelerating meaning, and rewarding simplicity. It does this differently in different people, different trait patterns, different nervous systems, and different social environments. It can show up in jealousy, shame, panic, outrage, righteousness, abandonment, fear, and even the theoretical argument itself. And unless we learn to read that movement while it is happening, we will keep confusing intensity with insight. The seductive power of certainty, there is something deeply relieving about certainty. Even when it is painful, even when it is harsh, even when it is wrong, certainty brings shape. It gives the mind something to stand on. It reduces the ache of not knowing. It closes the field. It ends the suspense. It tells the body, at least for a moment, that the uncertainty has been resolved. That is why certainty is so seductive under emotional activation, not because it is always true, but because it regulates. When the system is distressed, one clear explanation can feel easier to carry than an open question. One sharp interpretation can feel safer than waiting. One definite enemy can feel more manageable than ambiguity. This is why strong emotion so often moves towards certainty. It is not only trying to understand reality, it is trying to stabilize the body inside it. Research on intolerance of uncertainty has been saying versions of this for some time. Tonovic G. and German in 2018 described intolerance of uncertainty as the perception of uncertainty itself as threatening, and later work by Sahib and colleagues in 2023 linked intolerance of uncertainty to emotion regulation difficulties across emotional disorders. More recent studies in 2025 by Sun and by Adamus and colleagues continue to show that intolerance of uncertainty is strongly tied to anxiety severity and emotional dysregulation. In plain language, uncertainty is not just cognitively uncomfortable for many people. It is physiologically and emotionally aversive. That matters because many of us still imagine certainty as a purely intellectual event. As if the mind gathers enough evidence, it concludes and then finally rests. But often the order is more intimate and more human than that. The body is distressed. Ambiguity is painful. The nervous system wants orientation. Uncertainty arrives not only as a belief, but as relief. Take panic. In panic, uncertainty becomes almost intolerable. The body is already activated. Heart rate rises. Breathing shifts. Attention narrows. The system starts scanning for danger and explanation. In that state, a conclusion can feel life-saving. Something is very wrong with me. This is a medical emergency. I'm losing control. I know what this is, and it is serious. The interpretation may be inaccurate, but the certainty is regulating because it closes the field. The mind prefers a terrifying certainty to an undefined bodily storm. Biddell in 2024, writing from an active inference perspective, linked uncertainty, arousal, and well-being in ways that fit this pattern closely. Increasing uncertainty and arousal interact, and the system seeks coherence, even when the coherence it reaches is maladaptive. Jealousy works in much the same way. Jealousy does not simply want truth. It wants resolution. It wants to collapse possibility into one knowable frame. If a person you care about feels distant, delayed, distracted, or emotionally unavailable, the uncertainty can be excruciating. Not knowing whether you are safe, valued, preferred, or at risk can be harder to tolerate than a painful conclusion. So jealousy often turns quickly toward interpretation. I know what's happening. I know what they're really doing. I know who they would rather be with. This may or may not reflect reality, but the certainty itself is doing emotional work. It protects against the unbearable openness of not yet knowing. Shame is another powerful example. Under shame, certainty often takes the form of a verdict. Not a verdict about the external world, but about the self. This proves what I am. This confirms my worst fear. I know what this means about me. The seduction here is not pleasure. It is closure. Shame would often rather sentence the self than remain in unresolved vulnerability. An open question like what happened here really? Is it too spacious for a shared system? The body wants an answer now, even if the answer is brutal. That is why shame can feel so final. It is emotionally regulatory in the most punishing way. It narrows, condemns, and closes. Rage and moral outrage reveal another side of the same mechanism. When we are angry enough, certainty can feel almost righteous. The body fills with energy. The mind sharpens around blame. Nuance begins to look suspicious. Complexity begins to feel like evasion. The certainty is rewarding not only because it reduces ambiguity, but because it gives direction. It gives a target. It lets action feel justified. This is one reason outrage spreads so effectively online. Social environments often reward emotionally certain interpretations more than reflective ambiguity. Yale researchers summarizing work on outrage in 2021 put it simply, likes and shares teach people to express more outrage online. In such environments, certainty is not only regulating internally, it is socially reinforced externally. Now this is the point where many people try to rescue themselves with a rationalist story. They tell themselves that certainty comes from evidence alone, that if they feel strongly convinced, it must be because the facts are compelling. But neuroscience and behavioral research do not really support such a clean divide. Emotions and decision-making are deeply entangled. The 2024 systematic review by Hassan Marquez and colleagues on emotions in strategic decision-making argued that emotion is not some contaminant added after the real thinking is done. It influences the decision process itself. The broader neuroscience review from 2022 similarly argued that emotion and cognition are partners in organized decision-making, rather than rivals where one degrades the other from the outside. That does not mean emotion is the enemy. It means certainty is often more embodied than we admit. It is not only a conclusion. It is a state, a feeling of closure, a reduction in competing possibilities, a settling of the system around one frame. This is where the seductive quality becomes easier to understand. The mind under stress does not simply want truth in the abstract. It wants enough coherence to keep going. That is why certainty can feel like safety, not real safety in the deeper sense, perhaps, but immediate orientation. The body can say, now I know what this is. Now I know what to do. Now I know who is to blame. Now I know what kind of world I'm in. And there is real reward value in that. Even consumer and decision-making research in 2025 found that reward certainty strengthens motivational pull. That finding sits in a very different literature, but the broader point translates well. Certainty itself has reinforcing power. It changes how strongly an outcome or conclusion grips the person. Now let's slow that down in ordinary life. Imagine you are in conflict with someone close to you. They say something ambiguous, not obviously cruel, not obviously harmless, just ambiguous enough to leave space. That space is where uncertainty lives, and that space can feel unbearable under activation. So the body starts trying to close it. Step 1, a phrase lands. Step 2, the body tightens. Step 3, the mind begins searching for meaning. Step 4, several possibilities briefly exist. Step 5, one emotionally charged interpretation becomes dominant. Step 6, the relief of having an answer begins to feel like the truth. This is the seductive part. The answer may hurt, but it stabilizes. It says, now I know what happened. And once that certainty appears, the body may calm slightly, not because the reality is resolved, but because the uncertainty has been replaced. This is why certainty can become addictive in conflict. It reduces the torment of ambiguity. It spares us from waiting. It lets us move into defense, accusation, withdrawal, control, explanation, self-protection, and often that feels better than not knowing. Philosophically, this should make us cautious, because it means the experience of certainty cannot be treated as self-validating. The felt rightness of a conclusion may tell us as much about our state as it tells us about the world. A phenomenological approach would say that the horizon of the world has narrowed, and one meaning has become total. A predictive processing approach would say that the brain has reduced uncertainty by settling on a high-weight interpretation. A contemplative approach might say that the mind has grasped at one frame to escape the discomfort of openness. Different vocabularies, perhaps, but pointing toward one event, the seductive closure of uncertainty through conviction. And here is where ego enters, because certainty not only regulates feeling, it can regulate identity. To be certain is to feel temporarily organized, to be the one who knows what is happening, to be the one who has seen through the ambiguity, to be the one who does not hesitate. In this way, certainty can become part of self-maintenance. It is not only a response to uncertainty, it is a defense against feeling confused, powerless, naive, ashamed, or dependent. That is why some people cling to certainty so fiercely, not only because they want to be right, but because not being right threatens something deeper in them. It may threaten dignity, control, belonging, moral identity, competence, the image of being perceptive, strong, or awake. Once certainty is tied to identity, the possibility of revising it becomes emotionally expensive. This is true in politics, spirituality, relationships, and self-description alike. A person may hold certainty because it organizes their world. A group may hold certainty because it organizes belonging. A theory may be defended because it organizes professional selfhood. And here again we see the same pattern at different scales. The seductive power of certainty is not just individual psychology. It is social and cultural too. This is one reason uncertainty tolerance is such a profound issue. Alquist and Fayed in 2024, writing in Current Directions in Psychological Science, argued for learning to tolerate uncertainty more constructively. That matters because the problem is not uncertainty itself. The problem is our relationship to it. If uncertainty is treated as intolerable, then certainty will always be overvalued, even when it is premature. If uncertainty can be endured, then reflection has a chance to stay alive longer. This is also where emotional maturity begins to look different from what many of us imagine. It is not simply the ability to feel strongly, nor the ability to remain cold. It is the ability to stay with uncertainty long enough that intensity does not immediately become verdict. That is hard. It means allowing questions to remain open while the body wants closure. It means recognizing the relief in certainty without worshipping it. It means noticing when conviction is acting like a painkiller. It means being willing to say, this feels true, but I may still be inside a narrowed state. That sentence alone can change a life, not because it denies feeling, but it restores humility to interpretation. And perhaps humility is exactly what certainty most resists. Certainty wants finality. Humility keeps the field open. Certainty says, I know what this is. Humility says, I know this matters, but I may not yet see it fully. That difference is everything. Because when certainty becomes too rewarding, too regulating, too identity protective, it can seduce us away from the slower, more difficult, more honest work of staying with complexity. And complexity is often where reality actually lives, not because everything is vague, not because there are no truths, but the truth is often larger than the first, emotionally satisfying explanation. So the real task in this part of the episode is not to destroy certainty. It is to understand its emotional appeal, to see why it feels so good. Why does it come so quickly? Why does it stabilize? Why does it attract the distress system? Why it can feel like clarity even when awareness has narrowed. Once you understand that, you become less likely to be fooled by the relief certainty offers. You still feel it, you still notice its power, but you no longer mistake its emotional reward for proof. That is where a more conscious relationship to feeling begins, not by refusing intensity, but by noticing when certainty starts functioning as comfort rather than truth. When conviction becomes defense, one of the hardest things to see in ourselves is that conviction is not always serving truth. Sometimes it serves as protection. Sometimes the mind becomes certain not because reality has become fully clear, but because uncertainty has become too painful to hold. Sometimes the explanation we cling to is not the deepest truth of the situation, but the fastest structure available to a system that is trying to defend itself from helplessness, shame, grief, vulnerability, or not knowing. That is what makes conviction so complicated, because conviction is not always false, but it is not always free. It may carry truth. It may also carry defense. If we do not understand that, we will keep mistaking emotionally useful certainty for emotionally neutral clarity. This is especially important in the kinds of moments that feel most personal. A person does not text back quickly enough. A partner goes quiet. A friend sounds distracted. Someone offers feedback. Someone looks away at the wrong moment. A colleague uses a tone that catches in the body. A room changes, and you cannot quite explain why. In these moments, conviction can begin forming before the event has actually been explored. They're rejecting me. They're disrespecting me. They're trying to control me. They think I'm weak. I know what this means. I know what kind of person they are. I know what they really meant. Sometimes those interpretations will contain something real, but often they also do something defensive. They protect the system from staying open to a more vulnerable question. Questions like, what if I don't know yet? What if this touched something older in me? What if I'm afraid? What if I feel small? What if this hurts more than I want to admit? What if I'm trying to avoid the uncertainty of waiting? What if blame feels easier than helplessness? That is where conviction becomes defense, not when it is simply strong, but when it protects us from the emotional cost of staying open. This is where psychology helps, especially the long tradition of thinking about defense mechanisms. Valiant's work, especially in 1992, and then again in later updates, made the useful point that defenses are not just pathological oddities. They are organized ways the mind protects itself from overwhelming effect, conflict, and internal contradiction. More recent work by Di Giuseppe and colleagues in 2024 continues to show that defensive functioning is strongly related to psychological distress and interpersonal style. In other words, defense is not only something hidden in the unconscious in an old-fashioned sense. It is active in everyday life. It shapes perception, feeling, tone, and conviction. A person may become certain not because they are seeing clearly, but because certainty is helping them not feel something else. PMC, ncbi.nlm.nih.gov projection is one of the clearest examples. Projection does not always mean inventing something from nowhere. Often it means relocating discomfort, fear, hostility, shame, or doubt outward, and then reading it back as though it belongs fully to the other person. A person feels threatened and becomes convinced the other is threatening. A person feels ashamed and becomes convinced the other is condemning them. A person feels inner conflict and becomes sure the other is the unstable one. The defensive move here is not random. It protects the self from having to hold too much inward contradiction at once. That does not mean the other person is innocent in every case. It means the speed and confidence of the interpretation may be doing emotional work beyond simple perception. The same is true of jealousy. Jealousy often looks like insight from the inside. It says, I can feel it, I know what's going on, I know where this is leading. But many times jealousy is protecting against uncertainty, vulnerability, and the terror of not being chosen. It is easier, in one sense, to become convinced than to remain exposed. Easier to turn the open wound of uncertainty into a closed conclusion. The conviction may be painful, but it gives shape to the pain. It says, now I know what to defend against. Shame-based certainty works similarly. A person makes a mistake, receives a look, hears a tone, feels a shift in a room, and suddenly conviction arrives. This proves everything. I'm the problem. I ruin things. I always do this. Shame often moves very quickly from moment to moment and a verdict. The defensive function here is not obvious at first because the conclusion looks self-punishing, not self-protective. But it is still defensive in an important sense. It closes the question. It avoids the slower and more painful uncertainty of remaining with something unfinished, relational, and complex. Better for the shame system to sentence the self than to remain open to not yet knowing what the moment fully means. This is why certainty can be harsh and still be defensive. Defense does not always look comforting. Sometimes it looks brutal. Sometimes it looks accusatory. Sometimes it looks morally righteous. Sometimes it looks like self-condemnation. But the common thread is the same. It protects the system from an affect to uncertainty it does not want to remain with. Neuroscience and predictive processing offer another layer here. If the brain is continually generating predictions about the world and updating them through incoming signals, then conviction can be understood partly as a high-confidence interpretation that reduces uncertainty. The system is trying to stabilize its model. That is useful when the model is flexible and reality-based. It becomes dangerous when emotional activation pushes one interpretation to dominate too quickly. In that case, conviction becomes less about truth and more about reducing prediction error in the most emotionally bearable way available. That sounds technical, but lived experience is simple enough. The mind would rather have a painful explanation than no explanation. The body would rather brace around something than remain suspended in ambiguity. The self would often rather blame, condemn, accuse, or harden than stay undefended in the open. That is why conviction becomes a defense so easily, and this is especially clear in relationships. Someone goes quiet, and instead of saying, I feel uncertain and that scares me, the mind says they're obviously pulling away. Someone challenges us, and instead of saying, I feel exposed, the mind says they're attacking me. Someone sets a boundary, and instead of saying, I feel hurt or unwanted, the mind says they're controlling, selfish, cold. Again, the issue is not that these interpretations are never true. It is that they often arrive with a speed and force that reveals they are doing protective work. Contemplative traditions have described this in another way for a long time. They speak of grasping, identification, aversion, and contraction. The mind seizes a view because the view is easier to hold than the rawness underneath it. In that language, conviction becomes a kind of shelter, not always a healthy one, but a shelter nonetheless. Some contemplative science research in 2024 on mindfulness and emotional regulation suggests that training attention can reduce the speed which emotional reactions harden into self-confirming narratives. In plain language, more awareness can create more room before defense becomes destiny. pmc.ncbi.nlm.nih.gov. This is why the work is not simply to distrust conviction. It is to become curious about what conviction is protecting. What does this certainty save me from having to feel? What would happen if I did not rush to this conclusion? What is more unbearable here, the pain itself or the not knowing? What am I defending against with this explanation? What has become emotionally easier because I now know what this means? Those questions do not make us weaker. They make us less captive. Because the moment conviction is seen as potentially defensive, it loosens slightly. It may still feel real. It may still contain truth. But it is no longer about the question. It is no longer the only thing in the room. The other layers, the fear, the shame, the grief, the helplessness, the need for control, the need for dignity, begin to come into view. And once they do, something changes. We stop treating certainty as the end of the inquiry. we begin treating it as part of the material. That is where more conscious life begins, not when we stop feeling strongly, not when we stop forming convictions, but when we become able to ask whether our conviction is opening us to reality or defending us from it. How relationships and society collapse under emotional certainty when a strong feeling is mistaken for truth at the level of one person. It can damage a conversation. When the same pattern is repeated between people, it can damage a relationship. When it is scaled across groups, platforms, politics, and public life, it can begin damaging a culture. That is why emotional certainty matters so much. Because it does not stay private. It moves outward. It enters through tone. It enters through language. It enters through accusation. It enters in group identity. It enters the stories people tell about each other. It enters through public outrage. It enters moral judgment. It enters the atmosphere of entire conversations before anyone has slowed down enough to ask what is actually happening. Once that happens, relationships begin collapsing under the weight of interpretations that feel true because they are intense, not because they have been fully tested. You can see this most clearly in intimate life. A partner becomes quiet, and the silence is not left open long enough to be explored. It is immediately filled with meaning. They are angry. They do not care. They are withdrawing. They are punishing me. I know this pattern. The certainty comes fast, and because it comes fast, the need changes. Questions turn into accusations. Curiosity disappears. The other person then feels misread or attacked, and their body shifts too. Now they become defensive, flat, overwhelmed, or withdrawn, and that very reaction appears to confirm the first emotionally charged conclusion. This is how emotional certainty becomes relational reality, not because the interpretation was clearly correct from the beginning, but because the certainty itself changed the field. This is one reason so many relationships break down around what seems, on the surface, like communication problems. But often the deeper problem is not communication in the abstract. It is a state interpreting state. One nervous system narrows, then another does the same. One person becomes morally certain, the other becomes self-protective. One person pursues, the other withdraws. One person says, "You always do this." The other says, "You never understand me." And within minutes, both are no longer meeting the living moment. They are defending themselves against the meanings that their activated states have already built. This is where attachment dynamics and effective neuroscience become very useful. A person with strong abandonment sensitivity may read distance quickly and over-interpret meaning. A person with high shame sensitivity may hear criticism everywhere once the body tightens. A person who protects through withdrawal may go emotionally offline before the conversation has even become dangerous in any objective sense. A person who protects through control may become certain in order not to feel powerless. Different people collapse in different directions, but the principle is the same. The more emotionally certain they become, the less relationally available they often are. And once both people are in that state, the relationship is no longer being shaped by reality alone. It is being shaped by defensive certainty on both sides. Text messages are an especially strong modern example of this. Thin context, delayed timing, incomplete tone, and emotional investment are a perfect recipe for certainty making. One delayed reply becomes a whole story. One short sentence becomes proof. One missing emoji becomes evidence of a shift in love, interest, or respect. None of this sounds very sophisticated when said slowly, but in the moment it can feel overwhelmingly real. That is because emotional certainty does not require much data. It requires a charge. And this is not limited to romance. Family life can collapse under emotional certainty too. A parent hears one phrase from an adult child and instantly turns it into disrespect. A son hears one criticism and turns it into total rejection. A sibling interprets one boundary as betrayal. An old role is activated, and suddenly nobody is in the present anymore. The room is full of history, but everyone experiences it as now. This is why emotionally charged families often repeat the same arguments for years. No cause, nobody is intelligent enough to understand the words. But because the certainty each person feels under activation makes the whole field too narrow for new information to land. And when we move out from intimate life into social life, the same process gets even stronger. Online arguments thrive on emotional certainty. A post triggers outrage. A quote is lifted out of context. A single sentence becomes the whole person. The body reacts. The mind simplifies. The audience reinforces. Then the emotional interpretation hardens into a public moral frame. This person is dangerous. These people are evil. This proves what they all are. Anyone who hesitates is complicit. Now certainty is no longer only relieving an individual's nervous system. It is organizing a group. This is where collective emotional collapse begins. Social media intensifies it because certainty performs better than nuance. Certainty is fast, legible, emotionally rewarding, morally energizing, and shareable. Nuance is slower. It does not spike the same chemical reward. It does not gather allies as quickly. It does not offer the same immediate regulation that blame and outrage do. Research on outrage expression online, including work by Brady and colleagues, has shown how social reinforcement increases the expression of moral emotional content. In simple terms, emotionally charged certainty gets rewarded, and what gets rewarded gets repeated. So the emotional architecture of the platform begins shaping the emotional architecture of the people using it. That matters because private contraction can very quickly become public distortion. A person feels threatened, they interpret fast, they express certainty. Others resonate with certainty. A group identity forms around it. Complexity drops, moral heat rises. The social field narrows. Now what started as an emotional state is functioning like a public truth. Politics operates this way constantly. Political outrage becomes persuasive not only because it contains real grievances, though often it does, but because outrage simplifies. It gives clean enemies, clean virtues, clean categories, and clean storylines. It reduces the burden of ambiguity. It tells people who is good, who is dangerous, who belongs, who threatens, who deserves empathy, and who deserves punishment. In emotionally uncertain times, that is incredibly seductive, because certainty creates order, not necessarily truthful order, but emotional order. We will often choose an emotionally satisfying order over a more complex and slower truth if the nervous system is dysregulated enough. This is why so much public life now feels like moral theater performed through activated states. People are not only debating ideas, they are trying to stabilize themselves through identity, certainty, and emotional alignment. The point is not always understanding. Often it is relief. Relief through belonging, through blame, through righteousness, through certainty. Shame spirals work similarly on a social level. A person is called out, criticized, exposed, or publicly misread. Their body moves into defense. Rather than staying with the painful and partial truth of the moment, they become more certain, more rigid, more self-justifying. Others respond to that certainty with more certainty. Soon the entire exchange is no longer about repair, truth, or understanding. It is about defended selves protecting themselves through hardened interpretations. Once enough of public life works this way, the culture itself begins losing tolerance for ambiguity. People want immediate conclusions, immediate positions, immediate purity, immediate condemnation, immediate allegiance. The capacity to say, something real is happening here, but we do not yet fully understand it, starts looking weak. But that sentence may be one of the last protections against collective distortion. Because when emotional certainty takes over at scale, we do not merely become louder, we become less conscious together, less able to hold contradiction, less able to tolerate waiting, less able to distinguish intensity from truth, less able to see that our social world is being shaped not only by facts, but by the nervous systems and identities through which those facts are being interpreted. That is the deeper warning in this part of the episode. When a strong feeling is mistaken for truth in one person, understanding collapses. When it happens in a relationship, it collapses. When it happens across a network, a culture begins collapsing into simplified enemies, permanent outrage, and hardened selves. And all of it begins the same way, with the leap from feeling to certainty happening too fast. That is why the work of consciousness in this age is not only personal calm, it is the recovery of enough space to stop every strong feeling from becoming an unquestioned social reality. Integration slowing the leap from feeling to truth. So, where does all of this leave us? If strong emotion can narrow awareness, accelerate meaning, reward certainty, and turn conviction into defense, then the work is not simply to become less emotional. The work is to become more conscious inside emotion. That is a very different task, because many people hear a conversation like this and move too quickly in one of two directions. Either they think the answer is to trust every feeling absolutely, because feelings are real and repression is harmful, or they think the answer is to distrust feeling altogether and become colder, more detached, more rational in some brittle, overcorrected way. But neither of those is wisdom. Emotion matters. It carries information. It tells us something about what is happening in us. It often points toward what hurts, what matters, what feels threatened, what feels precious, what feels intolerable, and what feels unfinished. So the aim is not to silence emotion. The aim is to slow the leap from feeling to truth. That leap is where so much unnecessary suffering begins. I feel abandoned, therefore I know what you meant. I feel ashamed, I know what I am. I feel outraged, therefore I know the whole moral picture. I feel jealous, therefore I know what is happening behind my back. I feel panicked, danger must be immediate. I feel hurt, my interpretation is complete. That is the movement we are trying to interrupt, not the feeling itself. The speed with which feeling becomes verdict, because once the verdict arrives, the field closes. Reflection becomes harder, curiosity becomes harder, relationships become harder, repair becomes harder, and the emotional system, having found an answer, now begins defending the answer as though it were reality itself. So integration begins with recognizing the sequence earlier in the body, earlier in the breath, earlier in the tightening, earlier in the sense that everything has become obvious, earlier in the emotional heat that says, I know exactly what this is. That moment matters, because often that is the moment when awareness is narrowing most quickly, even though the mind is about to call it clarity. So the practice becomes something like this. Can I feel this fully without immediately concluding from it? Can I recognize that this emotion is real, but that my interpretation may still be partial? Can I stay with the body's urgency without handing it total authority over meaning? Can I notice when certainty is relieving me, rather than revealing something cleanly? Those are not abstract questions. They are practical. They can be asked in the middle of ordinary life, in the middle of a text exchange, in the middle of a family argument, in the middle of online outrage, in the middle of jealousy, in the middle of shame, in the middle of moral certainty, in the middle of panic, in the middle of the moment where feeling starts becoming a worldview. If we can ask them early enough, something changes. Not necessarily the intensity at first. The intensity may still be there. The hurt may still be there. The anger may still be there. The shame may still be there. But the emotion is no longer alone in the room. Awareness has entered. That is often the first real turning point, because once awareness enters, the emotion is no longer the whole environment. It becomes part of the environment. Something can now observe the rush towards certainty. Something can recognize the defensive pull. Something can notice the narrowing. Something can say, this matters, this hurts, this is real in me, but I may not yet see all of it clearly. That sentence is one of the most powerful sentences in conscious life, not because it weakens truth, but because it protects truth from being swallowed by activation. There is strength in that, a quiet strength, not the strength of domination, not the strength of perfect self-control, but the strength to remain open a little longer than the nervous system wants to. That kind of strength can save conversations. It can save relationships. It can save us from building entire identities out of emotionally charged moments. It can save us from calling something final that was only intense. It can save us from using certainty as a shield against our own vulnerability. Perhaps that is the deepest integration of this episode. Emotion is not the enemy. Certainty is not always false. But when strong feelings collapse too quickly into conclusion, consciousness begins to shrink. So the work is not to become numb. It is not to become passive. It is not to become endlessly unsure. It is to become able to feel deeply without surrendering interpretation too quickly. To let emotion speak, but not rule alone. To let conviction arise, but not become unquestioned law. To let the body register what matters, while still making room for reflection to arrive before the world is fully reduced. That is what it means to slow the leap from feeling to truth. Perhaps in a culture that rewards immediacy, outrage, reaction, and certainty at every scale, that slowing is not a small act. It is a radical one. So this episode has been about a distinction that is simple to say, but very difficult to live. Feeling certain is not the same as seeing clearly. We've explored how emotion overtakes reflection, how activation simplifies reality, how certainty becomes seductive because it regulates, how conviction can function as defense, and how relationships and whole social environments begin collapsing under emotionally narrowed truth. We've looked at panic, jealousy, shame, outrage, righteousness, projection, urgency, and the way strong feelings can make one interpretation feel total. And through all of it, one thing has become clearer. Emotion does not just change how we feel. It changes what seems obvious, what seems threatening, what seems final, what seems morally certain, what seems true. That is why emotional life needs consciousness, not to suppress it, not to sterilize it, but to keep intensity from becoming the only authority in the room. Because once a strong feeling is mistaken for complete truth, the world becomes smaller. Relationships become harder, complexity becomes suspicious, and the self begins living inside verdicts it formed too quickly to test properly. So the real invitation of episode 6 is not emotional distance. It is emotional depth with interpretive humility. The humility to say, this is powerful in me, this matters, this may contain truth, but I may still be inside a narrowed field. That humility is not weakness. It is one of the strongest protections consciousness has. In the next episode, episode 7, dissociation, numbness, and quiet absence, we move into a very different response to overwhelm, because not all difficult states intensify us. Some dim us, some flatten us, some distance us, some remove us from the moment so quietly that even absence can begin to feel normal. In episode 7, we'll explore what happens when consciousness does not become sharp under pressure, but distant, when the system does not move into emotional flooding, but into quiet removal, leaving the moment feel safer than staying in it. We'll look at numbness, detachment, emotional absence, dissociation, hypoarousal, and the strange ways a person can remain outwardly functional while inwardly far away. Because if episode 6 explored the danger of too much emotional certainty, episode 7 explores the opposite pole. What happens when consciousness protects itself not through intensity, but through disappearance? I leave you with this as we come to the end. Notice when intensity starts pretending to be true. Notice the feeling. Respect it. Listen to it. But do not hand it to the whole world too quickly. Stay curious about what certainty is doing for you. Stay close to the vulnerability underneath it. Stay open long enough for reflection to arrive before the verdict hardens. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, you've been listening to the Consciousness Code podcast, episode 6, Emotional Hijacking and False Certainty. I'm James Miller.